Look at that, a Lagonda open tourer from the 1930s. Fine sight. But what about the road? How old is it? Who built it? And why? Spare a thought for Grampian's roads. Back in the mists of time, there were only tracks linking together settlements. Such tracks would usually keep to hillsides to avoid boggy ground, and goods were carried by pack horses. The first railroads were built by the Romans in an effort to introduce Mediterranean civilization to the most northern outpost of their empire. Routes were laid out in straight lines, using uniform construction and drainage methods. During AD 83 and 84, the great Roman Governor-General Agricola was determined to subdue the highlands north of the Clyde. The advance north began with supply roads being laid from Stirling to Strathcathro to the east of the mountains. Agricola's campaign was brief and indecisive, but the temporary Roman marching roads may well have been used as the basis for trading routes long after the end of the Roman occupation. For many centuries after the departure of the Romans, no advances were made in improving communications. Scotland's trading routes were interrupted by territorial boundaries. Castles like the mighty 12th century fortress of Kildrummy were built to secure passes and limit the activity of cattle thieves. It wasn't until the emergence of the cattle trade in the 14th century that improvements in land travel began to take place. Cattle from the breeding pastures of the north, the northeast, Western Highlands and Isle of Skye were driven by drovers to trysts or markets in southern Scotland. Routes became established, and it's recorded that a road existed over the Mount, or Grampian Ridge, in 1384, being a main route south for cattle drovers from the northeast to the major tryst at Crieff. The cattle were shod with steel shoes, similar to horseshoes, for the longer droves, to prevent damage to their hooves. Under these conditions, a drover's diet consisted of oatmeal and onions mixed with blood drawn from the cattle, forming the basis of black pudding. Many drove roads converged on the crossing at the Forth at Stirling, and records describe a continuous stream of beasts plodding slowly towards Falkirk Tryst and their unknown fate. In rural Grampian, rivers and burns had to be crossed at shallow fords, until stone bridges began to appear during the 17th century. The cattle were gathered and rested overnight in special enclosures where drovers' inns became established and still survive, like those at Boltonstone and this one at Potach on Deeside. Along with the southward heading drove roads, a network of local trade routes began to develop, serving weekly markets or fairs where horses, sheep and cattle were sold or exchanged. In 1658, a traveller complained that the road between Aberdeen and Stonehaven was encumbered with bogs that would bury a horse. Lack of proper construction led to deep rutting and roads were impassable to wheeled vehicles. To counter this, in 1669, an Act of the Scottish Parliament placed the responsibility for the development of the road network with local justices of the peace. Highway money was levied from landowners, and common folk were required to work on roads in their vicinity for a minimum of 6 days a year without payment. The highway money, or statute road building, proved ineffective. Wheeled traffic remained very rare in rural areas, goods being transported by pack-horse train or heavy timber sledges. As late as the year 1720, Sir Archibald Grant of Monymusk complained that he could not get his carriage from Aberdeen to Monymusk for want of roads to carry it, and that there was not a single wheeled vehicle on his estate at that time. The first systematic and successful campaign of road building in Grampian was the result of the Jacobite rebellions of 1715 and 1745. The government found it impossible to move troops into the Highlands and surrounding areas along the existing roads. In 1724, General George Wade was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Highlands, with orders to plan and build a network of roads. General Wade firstly built Fort William, Fort Augustus, and Fort George and linked them together by road. He and his successors then went on to construct over 1,000 miles of well-engineered roads. The troops themselves built the roads to a set standard and were given double pay and an extra pair of boots for their labours. Rivers and burns were crossed by fine stone bridges built by local masons to a military design. Wayside cabins were built to shelter the redcoats, and beer provided to discourage the drinking of local whisky. These shelters were known as king's houses, and many survive as wayside inns. A military road from Fort George via the Lech to Braemar and by Glenshee to Cwpa Angus was built by Wade's successor, General Caulfield, giving birth to the high village of Tomintoul in 1779. Later, a military road for wheeled vehicles was laid from Brechin via Fettercairn over the Cairn Mount and Potach Bridge to Bridge of Afford and via Clat to Huntly. Many of the military roads survive to this day, and in some cases, the original bridges still carry traffic, a tribute to their makers. By the late 18th century, Scotland was at peace, and there began a period of rapid agricultural development and land improvement. Trade increased accordingly, and a real need to develop a complete road network suitable for wheeled vehicles arose in 1792. Aberdeenshire decided to set up toll roads or turnpikes throughout the county. The first turnpikes had been established in England during the reign of Charles II during the 17th century. By 1788, 17 turnpike trusts were operating in Scotland, but none north of Perth. Eventually, in 1795, a Turnpike Act was passed for Aberdeenshire, making the county's landowners turnpike trustees. Individual trustees were responsible for a length of road within their area. They decided the route and were allowed to build toll gates or bars at 6-mile intervals at which they could charge a fee to the road user. The money raised was used to maintain the road in good order, with some profit for the trustees. The Afford Turnpike opened in 1810, and the church minister wrote that the turnpike roads had afforded facilities for communication and land carriage without which the agricultural improvements could not have been executed. Only now did horse-drawn vehicles become commonplace in Grampian region, and with them a new mobility. Public transport developed with the use of short and long-haul horse coaches and stage coaches on the new turnpike network. It's about this time that Ayrshire-born John Loudon McAdam commenced his survey of 30,000 miles of roads in Britain. He found the standard of the turnpike roads to be very poor, and in 1819 presented his findings to Parliament. McAdam recommended that all be repaired using his method of forming a convex crust of small angular stones, preferably crushed granite, over 10 inches deep, that allowed rainwater to drain into side ditches. MacAdam and his 3 sons were then appointed as surveyors to numerous turnpike trusts throughout Britain, and by the time MacAdam died in 1836, virtually the entire network had been treated to macadam crusts. MacAdam's work made possible the stagecoach and mail coach era with its wayside coaching inns and stables. The horses were liveried along with drivers and driven for around 30 miles, exchanged at the next inn and then ridden home. Most of the roads still in use today in Grampian follow the line of the old turnpike roads. The gates are gone, but the toll-keepers' houses remain with their characteristic semicircular front bay, designed to give the keeper a clear view of the road in each direction. In parallel with the work of John Loudon MacAdam, another prominent Scot, Thomas Telford, was engaged by the government in 1801 to survey communications in the Highlands. Telford was then appointed as engineer for new roads and bridges, and to construct the Caledonian Canal through the Great Glen. Over the next 18 years, Telford built 1,000 miles of new roads and repaired 280 miles of General Wade's military roads. This involved the construction of 1,200 new bridges in Scotland, including this remarkable structure at Craigellachie. The turnpike and stagecoach eras were brought to an abrupt end by the coming of the railways. When the Great North of Scotland Railway Company line to Afford opened in 1859, tollgate revenues on the Aberdeen Road were instantly halved. In 1865 in Aberdeenshire, as in the rest of Britain, a Roads Act was passed dissolving the turnpike trusts. They were replaced by a road trust financed from the rates with powers over all the roads in the county. This system, with refinements, still survives to this day. The railway boom greatly reduced the use of roads, except where no rail link existed. The steam railway locomotive gave rise to the steam road locomotive, or traction engine, and heavy road haulage by horse vehicle quickly gave way to steam. The great advantage of railways over road was exaggerated by the passing of the Red Flag Act of 1865, which imposed a speed limit of 4 miles per hour on road vehicles and made them suffer the indignity of being preceded by a man carrying a warning red flag. Britain's roads were saved by the cycle boom. From 1840, bone shakers, velocipedes, penny farthings, and eventually the safety cycle in 1885 needed roads. The bicycle was the first ever worldwide craze. Cycling clubs were formed throughout Britain, and cycling holidays on the near-deserted road network became enormously popular. Cyclists formed the Roads Improvement Association, and road safety signs began to appear. Pioneer cyclists cleared the way for the dawn of the new motoring era after the repeal of the Red Flag Act in 1896. Limited now to a heady 12 miles per hour, motor vehicles from the continent began to appear in ever-increasing numbers. Scotland's first motor car was a 3.5 horsepower Panhard imported into Kelso in 1895. In 1896, the first car arrived on Donside, a Daimler horseless carriage purchased by a Dr. Howie of Strathdon. During the great Edwardian motoring era, the motor car emerged as the accepted form of personal transport for the moneyed classes, and touring of the Highlands became fashionable. Motor bus services replaced horse-drawn coaches, and motor lorries and steam lorries replaced the traction engine for general haulage. The macadam road surface, however, was not designed to cope with the speed of the motor car. Dust became a real problem. Luckily, an answer was on hand in the form of a road surveyor, Mr. Pernell Hooley, who had invented a mixture of tar and slag which he christened tarmac. From 1909 onwards, tarmac was applied to existing macadam crusts throughout Britain's road network. The German Autobahn, of the mid-1930s sparked off a bid to develop motorways in Britain after the Second World War. In 1958, Britain's first section of motorway, the Preston Bypass, now part of the M6, opened. A year later, in 1959, 72 miles of the M1 were opened from London to Birmingham. Railways fell into total disarray, and branch lines began to disappear in the early 1960s under the famous Beeching Axe. In Grampian, the Kintore to Ufford line closed in 1965, along with many other picturesque branch lines. Today, we again rely largely on our roads. The network is constantly expanded and developed. Road building has become a highly mechanized industrial process. So, spare a thought for Grampian's roads.
To bring this video right up to date, we have added 4 minutes of extra footage supplied by Transport Scotland of one of the 2 largest roads projects in Scotland within the past couple of years. Work started on the long-awaited AWPR in 2015 and is due for completion this year.